have decided the right course of action is to resign.
I am resigning from the office of governor.
I'm here to give every possible explanation to every one of these allegations.
It has become increasingly clear to me in the last few days that I cannot run for office and try to manage the state's business at the same time.
Well, that last man was New York Governor David Paterson, dropping his election bid amid controversy and adding his name to a growing list of disgraced Democratic governors. So why is it that so many Democratic governors are going down? Joining me now to weigh in is a former New York gubernatorial candidate on the Republican side. He is now Hudson Institute President Herb London. Herb, great to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Nice to be with you.
So what is it? Is it just coincidence? Blagojevich, McGreevey, Spitzer, now Paterson with 2 investigations hanging over his head. What's going on?
Well, what's going on is obviously scandals have a very powerful role in what happens in these gubernatorial races. And the scandal, I think, that exists now is one, the Aquino scandal. That is the aqueduct scandal, where, in fact, a marginal group ends up with the contract. And the second,
that's the one that former Congressman Floyd Flake was apparently involved with. So.
And the second, of course, is this aide who had been accused of some sort of domestic
But I want
abuse.
to pull back a little before we get into the weeds of what's happening in New York. What's happening with the Democratic Party with regard to these governors? I mean, is it just coincidence? I mean, is it one of those things where it just happens that there's a spree of Democratic governors who are getting in trouble?
I think what happens is that there are a lot of people today who get in politics and believe that they are sufficiently arrogant that they can do almost anything. It is the belief that there are no longer boundaries, that in fact, if you are in power, you can pretty much determine the cost of your own actions. It's a little bit like Charlie Rangel, who in fact ignored the fact that he was getting $75,000 a year for a rented property in the Dominican Republic. How could you not know that? How could your accountants not know that? I mean, it's extraordinary display of arrogance.
But, you know, it's interesting you bring up Charlie Rangel, who's a delightful guy, very funny guy. He's a real glad-hander. But he, in fact, is head of one of the most powerful committees, House Ways and Means Committee. In fact, I saw him at a party just after he took over the job. I said, should I call you Mr. Chairman now? And he said, no, just call me King of the World. And he was, he was joking, but there is that hubris that comes along with the power that also governors have because they are sort of like the president of their state.
Well, there's a kind of hubristic quality. I think that you're absolutely right about that. But what is also very interesting about the Rangel case is that, in fact, he does believe that he has a certain kind of role that others do not possess, and a certain kind of power others do not possess. After all, he's responsible for tax policy in the United States, and yet he's avoiding paying some portion of his taxes. This is quite remarkable. And we see this, of course, with Blago as well, who's selling a seat in Chicago. Now, what you have with these kinds of
allegedly,
of course. I mean, what you have in these cases is people who have lost track of what it means to be a public servant. Right. They think they are governing the world, not serving as servants of the people.
But aren't we putting them back on track with things like the Tea Parties and with these recent elections have thrown the bums out, essentially, and are trying to bring in fresh blood to start the process over again?
Percolating just, I think, to the surface in American politics is a new wind that's blowing. And that wind is, of course, a lot of people who are simply tired of a government that has, I think, arrogated to itself far too much influence and far too much power.
Is there anything we can do to change the rules of the game to make sure that this doesn't become the norm?
No,
because, that is, every state has its own constitution.
David, I don't think the rules are really what's at stake here. Morality can be abused in a lot of different ways. No matter what the rules suggest, if you're in a position of authority and you decide to break the rules, there are ways of getting around it. The important thing to recognize is that there should be some boundaries. Those boundaries have to be understood by individuals. And when they take on the responsibility for being a public servant, they have to understand that they're serving the people, not serving themselves.
Quickly, when you were running for the gubernatorial race, and you were in a primary, okay, you were running as a conservative, forgive me, but did you get a sense of the lure of power that comes along with a job?
Well, you know something? I was very passionate about public policy issues. Whenever I would get up and give a speech, Republicans and Democrats would invariably look at me and say, do you really believe that stuff?
Right.
Well, I said, yes, I do. Well, they thought of me as an oddball, peculiar. What do you mean, an idealist actually running for office? You're far too earnest. You can't get anywhere. Well, the fact is I generated more votes than any third-party candidate running for governor in American history until Jesse Ventura broke my record. So there's something to be said for being earnest, and there's something to be said for idealism.
But when you went into that snake's nest, that sort of I, Claudius-style snake's nest of people, the power brokers inside Albany, what did it make you feel?
Well, I'll tell you something. It made me feel very uncomfortable. Uncomfortable because I understood that most of these people could not earn a dime in the private sector. And were it not for their public service, they would be on the streets of New York as penurious.
All right. And that's the problem. Honest people should not feel uncomfortable doing public service. And unfortunately, that's the way it's become these days. Herb London, good to see you. Coming up on deck, the president shocks